The stagecoach lurched over another rut in the dusty Nevada road, and Margaret Rose pressed her gloved hand against the window frame to steady herself, watching the endless stretch of sagebrush and sand roll past under the merciless afternoon sun of August 1883. She had been traveling for 3 weeks now, first by train from Boston, and then by this uncomfortable coach that seemed determined to rattle every bone in her body, all to reach a man whose face she had never seen, whose voice she had never heard, whose touch she could only imagine with a mixture of dread and resignation that made her stomach twist into knots. Her father had arranged the marriage 6 months ago, a business transaction more than a romantic union, sealed with a handshake and whiskey in his study, while Margaret had sat in the parlor pretending to embroider. Theodore Whitmore owned half of Cherry Creek, Nevada, or so her father had boasted, his mining operations pulling silver from the earth like he was drawing water from a well. At 43 years old, he needed a wife to cement his social standing, and Margaret, at 22, was the price her father was willing to pay to secure an investment in Whitmore's latest venture. She caught her reflection in the dusty window glass, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that made her look older than her years, her green eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and something deeper that she refused to name. Her traveling dress, once a respectable navy blue, was now covered in a fine layer of desert dust that seemed to penetrate everything despite the closed windows. The driver called out something she could not quite hear, and the coach began to slow. Margaret leaned forward, peering through the window as the first buildings of Cherry Creek came into view. The town was larger than she had expected, with a wide main street lined with false-fronted buildings that promised everything from dry goods to whiskey. The afternoon heat made the air shimmer above the packed earth road, and she could see men moving along the wooden sidewalks, their hats pulled low against the sun. The coach came to a stop in front of a building marked with a sign that read Cherry Creek Hotel and Boarding House, and the driver climbed down to open her door. Margaret took a deep breath, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands before accepting his assistance down the high step. The heat hit her immediately, so different from the humid summers of Boston. This was dry and relentless, sucking the moisture from her lips in seconds. "Miss Rosewood," a woman's voice called from the hotel's covered porch, and Margaret turned to see a stout woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair tucked under a sensible bonnet. "I am Mrs. Henderson. Mr. Whitmore sent word that you would be arriving today. He has arranged a room for you here until the wedding on Saturday." 4 days. Margaret had 4 days of freedom left before she became Mrs. Theodore Whitmore, bound to a man she did not love, committed to a life she had not chosen. She forced a smile and nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. That is very kind." The hotel room was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a simple quilt and a washstand in the corner. Mrs. Henderson left her with promises of hot water and a meal in the dining room whenever she was ready. Margaret removed her hat and gloves, then sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of what she was about to do. She had promised herself she would not cry, but tears burned behind her eyes anyway. Her mother had died 3 years ago, and without her gentle influence, her father had become harder, more focused on business than family. Her 2 older brothers had their own lives now, one in New York and one in Philadelphia, and neither had protested when their father announced Margaret's engagement to a man none of them had ever met. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She quickly dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief and called out permission to enter. Mrs. Henderson appeared with a pitcher of water and fresh towels. "Mr. Whitmore will be calling on you tomorrow morning at 10, the older woman said as she set the items on the washstand. "He is eager to meet his bride." Margaret wondered if Mrs. Henderson could hear the hollowness in her own voice when she replied, "I look forward to it." After the landlady left, Margaret washed her face and changed into a fresher dress, then ventured downstairs to the dining room. She was hungry despite her emotional turmoil, and the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread was too tempting to resist. The dining room was half full with other guests, mostly men who looked like miners or merchants, their conversations a low rumble punctuated by occasional laughter. She took a seat at a small table near the window and ordered the roast chicken dinner. While she waited, she watched the street outside, fascinated despite herself by the activity. A wagon loaded with mining equipment rolled past. A group of women in bright dresses that revealed far more ankle than was proper in Boston stood outside a saloon, calling out to passing men. Two young boys chased each other down the sidewalk, kicking up dust with their bare feet. Her meal arrived, and she was just taking her first bite when the dining room door opened and a man walked in who made her forget to chew. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his dusty work shirt in a way that suggested hard physical labor. His hair was dark brown and slightly too long, curling at the collar, and his face was tanned from the sun, with a strong jaw shadowed by a day's growth of beard. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a striking pale blue that seemed to see everything as he scanned the room. Those eyes landed on her for just a moment, and she felt a jolt run through her body that was entirely inappropriate and entirely undeniable. Then his gaze moved on, and he walked to the bar where Mrs. Henderson was supervising the serving staff. "Austin Kincaid, Mrs." Henderson greeted him warmly. "I did not expect to see you in town until Friday." "Finished the fence work early," he replied, and his voice was deep and rough-edged, the kind of voice that sounded like it belonged to someone who spent more time with horses than people. "Thought I would pick up supplies and maybe get a decent meal before heading back out." Margaret realized she was staring and quickly looked down at her plate, but she found herself listening to their conversation, despite her best intentions. "Will you be staying at the ranch then?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "For now. Mr. Patterson is talking about buying more land up north, wants me to ride out and take a look at it next week." They chatted for a few more minutes about people and places Margaret did not know, and then Austin Kincaid took a seat at the bar with his back to her. She could see his profile, the straight line of his nose, the way his hair fell forward when he leaned down to eat. She forced herself to focus on her own meal, disturbed by her reaction to a complete stranger. She was engaged, or as good as engaged. In 4 days, she would be married. She had no business noticing how another man filled out his shirt or how his voice made something in her chest tighten. After finishing her meal, she retreated to her room and tried to read a book she had brought from home, but the words swam on the page without meaning. Eventually, she gave up and prepared for bed, lying in the darkness and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Nevada night. Somewhere in the distance, a piano played in one of the saloons. Closer by, men's voices raised in argument and then laughter. The air that came through her open window was still warm, so different from the cool New England evenings she was accustomed to. She thought about Theodore Whitmore, trying to imagine what he would look like, how he would speak to her, whether he would be kind or cold, or something in between. Her father had assured her that Whitmore was a respected businessman that she would want for nothing as his wife. But her father had said nothing about affection or companionship or love because those things were not part of the arrangement. Against her will, her mind drifted to the cowboy she had seen in the dining room. Austin Kincaid. She wondered what it would be like to be noticed by a man like that, to be chosen rather than purchased. Then she pushed the thought away firmly. That kind of thinking would only make everything harder. She must have slept eventually, because she woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the sounds of the town coming to life below. She dressed carefully in her best day dress, a soft green that matched her eyes, and pinned her hair up with particular attention. If she was going to meet her future husband, she wanted to at least look presentable, even if her heart was not in the meeting. At precisely 10 o'clock, Mrs. Henderson knocked on her door to tell her that Mr. Whitmore had arrived and was waiting in the parlor. Margaret checked her reflection one final time, pinched her cheeks for color, and went downstairs with her heart hammering against her ribs. Theodore Whitmore stood when she entered the parlor, and her first thought was that he looked every year of his 43. He was not an unattractive man, but there was a hardness to him that reminded her uncomfortably of her father. His hair was dark with silver at the temples, his mustache carefully waxed, his suit expensive and well-tailored. His eyes, a muddy brown, swept over her with an assessing quality that made her feel like a horse being evaluated for purchase. Miss Rosewood, he said, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips in a gesture that was probably meant to be gallant but felt rehearsed. You are even lovelier than your father described. I am a fortunate man indeed. Mr. Whitmore, she replied, managing a curtsy. It is a pleasure to finally make your acquaintance. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, arranging her skirts carefully, while he took the chair across from her. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and she forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. I trust your journey was not too arduous? He asked finally. It was long, but I managed well enough. Excellent. You will find Cherry Creek quite different from Boston, I imagine. We are a young town, still rough around the edges, but growing rapidly. My mining operations employ over 100 men now, and I have just purchased a half interest in the new stamping mill being built at the north end of town. He continued talking about his business ventures, his properties, his plans for expansion, and Margaret realized with a sinking heart that he was not trying to get to know her at all. He was establishing his credentials, proving his worth as a husband in the only terms he seemed to understand: money and power. She made appropriate responses when he paused, but her mind was wandering. Through the parlor window, she could see the street outside, and as Whitmore droned on about silver yields and stock prices, she saw Austin Kincaid walk past, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. He moved with an easy confidence, touching his hat to a passing woman, stopping to let a child run in front of him. Then he was gone, and she dragged her attention back to Whitmore, who was now discussing the house where they would live after the wedding. It is the finest home in Cherry Creek, he said with evident pride. 2 stories, with a parlor, dining room, and library on the first floor, and 4 bedrooms above. I have hired a housekeeper and a cook, so you will not be burdened with menial labor. Your role will be to manage the household and provide me with heirs, of course. Heirs, not children, not a family, but heirs. Margaret felt something inside her grow cold and hard. Of course, she echoed. Whitmore stood, and she realized the interview was over. I will call on you again tomorrow. I thought we might take a drive so you can see more of the town and the surrounding area. Would that be agreeable? Very agreeable, she lied. He took her hand again, his grip firm and possessive. I am pleased with this arrangement, Miss Rosewood. I believe we will suit each other admirably. After he left, Margaret remained in the parlor for several minutes, staring at nothing. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her expression sympathetic. He is not so bad, dear, she said gently. A bit focused on business, perhaps, but he has never been cruel to anyone as far as I know. You could do worse. Margaret wanted to ask if she could also do better, but she bit her tongue. I am sure you are right. She spent the rest of the day in her room, trying to reconcile herself to her fate. She had known from the beginning what this marriage would be. She had no right to feel disappointed or trapped. This was the lot of many women, particularly those whose fathers needed business connections more than they needed their daughter's happiness. As evening approached, she found she could not bear to be confined any longer. She changed into a simpler dress and ventured out onto the street, telling herself she just wanted to see the town, to familiarize herself with what would be her new home. Cherry Creek was busier in the evening than it had been during the heat of the day. The saloons were doing brisk business, and the sound of music and laughter spilled out into the street. She walked along the sidewalk, peering into shop windows, noting the location of the general store, the post office, the doctor's office. She was passing the stable at the end of Main Street when she heard a hoarse whinny, followed by a man's soothing voice. Curious, she paused near the open door and looked inside. The interior was dim after the bright evening light, but she could make out the shapes of several horses in their stalls and a figure moving in the shadows. Easy there, girl, the voice said, and she recognized it immediately. Austin Kincaid stepped into a shaft of light streaming through a gap in the wall, running his hand along the neck of a beautiful chestnut mare. I know the saddle pinched you today. We will get the blacksmith to adjust it tomorrow. Margaret knew she should move on, but something held her in place. There was a gentleness in the way he handled the horse, a patience that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. The mare nuzzled his shoulder, and he laughed softly, reaching into his pocket for what looked like a piece of apple. "You are spoiled rotten, you know that?" he told the horse. "But I suppose I cannot blame you. If I had to carry my ugly hide around all day, I would demand treats too." Margaret could not help herself. She laughed at that, a small sound that she tried to stifle too late. Austin's head jerked up, his eyes finding her in the doorway. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, and Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Sorry," she said quickly. "I did not mean to intrude. I was just walking past and heard you talking to your horse." He studied her for a moment, then smiled, a slow expression that transformed his face from handsome to devastating. "No intrusion. Clara here likes an audience. She is vain that way." Margaret found herself stepping into the stable, drawn by something she did not quite understand. "Clara is a beautiful name for a beautiful horse. She's a good girl, best I have ever had." He patted the mare's neck one more time, then moved toward Margaret, wiping his hands on his trousers. "You are new in town. I saw you at the hotel yesterday." "Yes, I arrived yesterday afternoon. I am Margaret Rosewood." She extended her hand automatically, the way she had been taught in Boston society, and then immediately felt foolish. But Austin took her hand without hesitation, his grip warm and calloused, his touch sending that same jolt through her that she had felt when she first saw him. "Austin Kincaid," he said. "Welcome to Cherry Creek, Miss Rosewood. What brings you to our little corner of Nevada?" The truth stuck in her throat. She could not bring herself to say that she had been sold off to a man she did not love, that in 3 days she would marry Theodore Whitmore in a ceremony that would seal her fate. Instead, she said, "Family business." It was not quite a lie. Her father certainly considered it business. Austin released her hand, and she immediately missed the contact. "Well, I hope the family business turns out favorably. Cherry Creek is a good town, full of good people for the most part. A bit wild sometimes, but that is the nature of Nevada." They stood there in the stable, the light fading outside, and Margaret knew she should leave, knew that being here alone with a man she had just met was improper and potentially dangerous to her reputation. But she did not want to leave. Standing here talking to Austin Kincaid felt like the first real moment she had experienced since leaving Boston, the first time she had felt like herself rather than a chess piece being moved across a board by her father's hand. "Do you work nearby?" she asked, desperate to prolong the conversation. "I am foreman at the Patterson Ranch, about 5 miles north of town. We run cattle mostly, some horses. It is good work, honest work. You must love it to speak of it that way." He looked surprised, as if no one had ever made that observation before. "I suppose I do. There is something about working with animals and the land that makes more sense to me than anything else I have ever done. The work is hard, but it is straightforward. The cattle do not lie to you, and the land does not pretend to be something it is not." There was something in his voice when he said that, a bitterness that suggested he had been lied to before, that he valued honesty above almost anything else. Margaret felt a sharp pang of guilt because she was lying to him right now, by omission if not by outright falsehood. "That sounds wonderful," she said softly. "To do work that you love." "Not everyone has that luxury," Austin said, his pale blue eyes studying her face in a way that made her feel like he could see straight through to all her secrets. "Sometimes we have to do what duty demands rather than what our hearts want." Did he somehow know? Could he tell just by looking at her that she was about to commit herself to a loveless marriage? Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm evening air. "I should return to the hotel," she said abruptly. "It is getting late, and I do not want Mrs. Henderson to worry." Austin nodded, but something had shifted in his expression, a guardedness that had not been there before. "Of course. Can I walk you back? A lady should not be on the streets alone after dark." She should refuse. She should tell him that she could manage perfectly well on her own. But instead, she found herself nodding, and they stepped out of the stable together into the gathering twilight. They walked in silence for a moment, the sounds of the town surrounding them, music and laughter and the occasional shout from the saloons. Then Austin said, "If you do not mind my asking, how long will you be staying in Cherry Creek?" Forever, she thought. I will be here forever, trapped in a marriage I do not want, bound to a man I do not love. But she said, I am not certain yet. It depends on how the family business concludes. They reached the hotel, and she turned to face him, tilting her head back to meet his eyes. He was so tall, and there was such strength in him, but also gentleness. She found herself wondering what it would be like to be held by those strong arms, to be looked at by those blue eyes with something more than polite interest. "Thank you for the escort, Mr. Kincaid," she said formally. "Austin," he corrected. "And it was my pleasure, Miss Rosewood." "Margaret," she replied, before she could stop herself. He smiled again, that slow, devastating smile. "Margaret. That is a beautiful name. It suits you." She felt herself blushing like a schoolgirl and quickly looked away. "Good night, Austin." "Good night, Margaret." She practically fled into the hotel, her heart racing, her hands trembling as she climbed the stairs to her room. Once inside, she leaned against the closed door and pressed her palms to her hot cheeks. What was wrong with her? She had no business feeling this way about a cowboy she had just met. No business feeling anything at all for any man other than her intended husband. But as she prepared for bed that night, it was not Theodore Whitmore's face she saw in her mind. It was Austin Kincaid's blue eyes and gentle smile, the way he had touched his horse with such care, the sound of his deep voice in the dim stable. She dreamed of him that night, dreams that left her tangled in her sheets and aching with a longing she had never experienced before. The next morning, Theodore Whitmore arrived promptly at 10 with a gleaming black buggy and a matched pair of horses. Margaret forced herself to smile as he helped her up to the seat, tried to feel grateful for the cushioned comfort and the shade of the canopy overhead. But as they drove through town and out into the desert beyond, she could not help comparing everything about Whitmore to Austin. Where Austin had been warm and easy in conversation, Whitmore was formal and self-important. Where Austin had spoken with passion about his work, Whitmore spoke only of profit margins and expansion. Where Austin's touch had sent electricity through her veins, Whitmore's made her skin crawl. He showed her his largest mine, the entrance cut into a hillside, like a wound in the earth, the constant stream of men and ore carts flowing in and out like blood from an artery. He explained the process of extracting the silver, the costs and the yields, the technical challenges and solutions. He never once asked her opinion or her thoughts, never seemed to consider that she might have anything to contribute to the conversation beyond admiring nods. As they drove back toward town, he said, I have arranged for the ceremony to take place at my home on Saturday at 2 o'clock. Reverend Matthews will officiate. I have invited several of the town's leading citizens to witness, and there will be a dinner afterward. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. That sounds lovely. I have also commissioned a dress for you from Mrs. Chin, the dressmaker on 2nd Street. She will need you to come for a fitting this afternoon. He had chosen her wedding dress. He had not asked what she might like, had not consulted her on the color or the style, had simply ordered it as he might order a piece of furniture for his fine house. Something in her chest tightened, a feeling like a trap closing around her. She opened her mouth, not sure what she was going to say, when a rider appeared on the road ahead of them, moving fast. As the figure drew closer, she recognized the lean form and dark hair of Austin Kincaid. He reined in his horse as he reached them, and Whitmore pulled the buggy to a stop. Margaret's heart was hammering in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Whitmore, Austin said with a nod, his expression neutral. Then his eyes moved to Margaret, and something flickered in those blue depths before he controlled it. Miss Rosewood. Kincaid, Whitmore said coolly. What brings you into town again so soon? I thought Patterson kept you busy at that ranch of his. Fence repair, Austin replied, but his gaze remained on Margaret. It is good to see you again, Margaret. The use of her first name was deliberate, she realized, and Whitmore noticed too. His jaw tightened, and he reached over to take her hand possessively. Miss Rosewood and I were just discussing our wedding on Saturday, Whitmore said, his tone making it clear that he was staking his claim. She will be Mrs. Whitmore by the end of the week. Margaret watched the color drain from Austin's face. He looked at her, and she saw shock in his eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like hurt. Then his expression shuttered completely, becoming blank and unreadable. Congratulations, he said, his voice flat. I hope you will both be very happy. He touched his hat brim and rode on without another word, his back rigid, his horse moving faster than necessary down the dusty road. Margaret felt something tear inside her chest, a pain so acute she almost gasped aloud. You have made quite an impression on the ranch foreman, Whitmore observed, his tone light, but his eyes hard. But I trust you understand that your acquaintance with men like Kincaid must end now. As my wife, you will associate only with people of appropriate social standing. People of appropriate social standing. Not cowboys who spoke gently to their horses and smiled like sunrise. Not men who did work they loved and valued honesty above all else. Margaret felt the walls of her prison settling into place around her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been avoiding since she arrived in Cherry Creek. She did not want this. She did not want Theodore Whitmore, or his fine house, or his social position. She wanted something real, something true, something that made her heart race the way it had raced when Austin Kincaid took her hand in his. But what she wanted did not matter. The arrangements had been made, the agreements signed. In 3 days, she would become Mrs. Whitmore, and that would be the end of her own story and the beginning of her role as supporting character in his. That afternoon, she endured the dress fitting with Mrs. Chen, a tiny Chinese woman with sharp eyes and gentle hands who pinned and tucked and measured without comment. The dress was beautiful, Margaret had to admit. White silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, the style elegant and expensive. But as she stood on the fitting platform, looking at herself in the mirror, she felt like she was looking at a stranger, a woman playing dress-up in someone else's life. That evening, she did not go downstairs for dinner. She claimed a headache and asked for a tray to be sent to her room, but the truth was that she could not face seeing anyone. She sat by her window as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, and tried to imagine what her life would be like a week from now, a month from now, a year from now. She would wake up in Theodore Whitmore's bed. She would eat breakfast in his dining room. She would entertain his business associates and bear his children and grow old in his house, and none of it would be her choice. A soft knock at her door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Your dinner, Miss Rosewood," Mrs. Henderson's voice called. Margaret opened the door to find not only the tray, but also Mrs. Henderson herself, her kind face creased with concern. "Are you unwell, dear?" she asked, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "Just tired," Margaret lied. "The heat is more oppressive than I am accustomed to." Mrs. Henderson studied her for a long moment, and Margaret had the uncomfortable feeling that the older woman saw far more than she was saying. It takes time to adjust to Nevada, and to other things as well. Margaret sank into the chair by the table, no longer able to maintain the pretense. "May I ask you something, Mrs. Henderson?" "Of course, dear." "Do you know Mr. Whitmore well?" The landlady's expression became carefully neutral. "Well enough. He has lived in Cherry Creek for 5 years now, since the silver strike that made his fortune." "What kind of man is he?" "Truly?" Mrs. Henderson was silent for so long that Margaret thought she might not answer. Then she sighed and sat down on the edge of the bed. "He is not a bad man, Margaret. He has never been cruel or violent. He pays his debts and keeps his word. But he is not a warm man either. He sees the world in terms of transactions and acquisitions. I would not want my own daughter to marry him, but I have seen far worse matches. So I should be grateful? Margaret heard the bitterness in her own voice. I think you should be honest with yourself about what you are walking into, and if you cannot face it, then you should not walk into it at all. Margaret looked up sharply. What do you mean? Mrs. Henderson met her gaze steadily. I mean that no woman should be forced into a marriage she does not want. I know your father made arrangements, but you are the one who has to live with the consequences. If you truly cannot bear the thought of marrying Theodore Whitmore, then say so now before it is too late. And do what? Margaret asked, despair welling up inside her. Go back to Boston? My father will never forgive me. I will be ruined, an embarrassment to the family. There are other places besides Boston, other lives you could live. Mrs. Henderson stood and moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the knob. I am not telling you what to do, Margaret. I am just reminding you that you have choices, even if they are not easy ones. After she left, Margaret stared at her untouched dinner and thought about choices. She had choices. Mrs. Henderson was right about that. She could refuse to marry Whitmore. She could leave Cherry Creek, start over somewhere new. But what kind of life would that be? She had no money of her own, no skills that would earn her a living. She could perhaps find work as a governess or a seamstress, but those were hard lives, lonely lives. And yet, would those lives be any lonelier than being married to a man who saw her as just another acquisition? She did not know the answer. She went to bed that night with her mind churning, and she woke the next morning no closer to a decision than she had been the night before. Thursday passed in a blur. Whitmore called on her again, this time bringing flowers and speaking of plans for their honeymoon, a trip to San Francisco that he had arranged for 2 weeks hence. Margaret smiled and nodded and said all the right things, but inside she felt like she was drowning, pulled down by currents too strong to fight. That evening, desperate for air and space and solitude, she waited until after dark and then slipped out of the hotel, walking quickly toward the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open desert. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light over the landscape, and the air had finally cooled to something bearable. She walked without direction, just moving, trying to outpace the thoughts that haunted her. She did not realize how far she had come until she found herself near the stable where she had first truly spoken to Austin. The building was dark, the horses quiet inside, and she stood in the shadow of the wall, trying to catch her breath. Margaret? She spun around to find Austin standing a few feet away, his face shadowed in the moonlight. He must have been coming from the saloon across the street, though he did not look or smell drunk. What are you doing out here alone? He asked, his voice sharp with concern. Do you have any idea how dangerous it is for a woman to be wandering around at night? I needed air, she said defensively. I needed to think. He moved closer, and she could see his expression now, the worry and frustration warring in his eyes. Think about what? Your wedding is in 2 days. Seems like the time for thinking has passed. How do you know when I am getting married? She challenged. Everyone in town knows. Whitmore has been crowing about it to anyone who will listen. His beautiful young bride from Boston, his trophy to show off to all the other mine owners. The bitterness in his voice surprised her. Why do you care? I do not, he said, too quickly. It is none of my business who you marry or why. They stood there in the darkness, the space between them charged with something Margaret did not know how to name. Then Austin exhaled roughly and ran his hand through his hair. That is a lie, he said quietly. I do care. I should not, but I do. Margaret's heart stopped, then started again at double speed. Austin, when I saw you in the hotel that first day, I thought you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. And then when we talked in the stable, when you laughed at me talking to my horse, I felt something I have not felt in a long time. Something that scared me and excited me all at once. He looked away, his jaw clenched. But you are engaged to Whitmore. You are going to marry him, and I have no right to feel anything about that. I do not want to marry him, Margaret heard herself say, the words spilling out before she could stop them. I do not want any of this. My father arranged it all, and I came here because I did not think I had any other choice, but now I feel like I am suffocating, like I am being buried alive. Austin looked at her sharply. Then do not marry him. It is not that simple. Why not? You are here. You are free. Just say no. Tell Whitmore the wedding is off and go somewhere else, be someone else. With what money? I have no resources of my own. I have no skills that would allow me to support myself. And even if I did, my father would never forgive me. I would be disowned, cut off from my family forever. Is your family worth keeping if they would force you into a marriage you do not want? It was a fair question, and Margaret had no good answer for it. Her family had not been particularly loving or supportive since her mother's death. Her father saw her as a business asset, and her brothers had their own lives that did not include much consideration for her. I do not know, she admitted. I do not know anything anymore. Austin stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body in the cool night air. I know something, he said softly. I know that life is too short to spend it being miserable. I know that you deserve better than a man who sees you as a trophy. And I know that if you were mine, I would spend every day making sure you knew how precious you are. Margaret could not breathe. The intensity in his eyes, the rough emotion in his voice, the way he was looking at her like she was something infinitely valuable, it was everything she had never known she wanted and everything she could not have. But I am not yours, she whispered. I am promised to Theodore Whitmore. Promises can be broken, not without consequences. There are consequences to keeping them too. Austin reached out slowly, giving her time to move away, and when she did not, he touched her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her cheek. Margaret, I am not a rich man. I have a small piece of land of my own, but nothing like Whitmore's mines and mansion. I could not give you silk dresses or fancy dinner parties, but I could give you honesty and respect, and a partner instead of a master. I could give you a choice. A choice. That word again. The thing she had been denied her entire life. Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming emotion of being offered something she had never dared to hope for. I do not know you, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Then get to know me. Do not marry Whitmore on Saturday. Come out to my place instead, spend some time with me, see if what I am feeling and what I think you are feeling is real or just madness. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, wiping away a tear that had escaped. Give us a chance, Margaret. Give yourself a chance. Everything in her upbringing, every lesson about duty and propriety and social obligation, screamed at her to refuse. But something deeper, something that came from her heart instead of her head, was screaming even louder. What would I tell Whitmore? She asked. What would I tell the whole town? The truth, that you are not ready to get married, that you need more time, or a lie if the truth is too hard, that you are ill, that you need to return to Boston for a family emergency. It does not matter what you tell them, Margaret. What matters is that you do not tie yourself to a man you do not love when there is another option. You do not know me either, she pointed out, even as hope was blooming in her chest like a flower opening to the sun. What if you are wrong about what you are feeling? What if I am not what you think I am? Then we will find that out together, and we will part as friends, but at least we will know, instead of spending the rest of our lives wondering what might have been. Margaret looked up into his blue eyes, so clear and honest in the moonlight, and felt something inside her shift and settle into place. Mrs. Henderson had told her she had choices. Austin was offering her one. It was terrifying and inappropriate and completely irresponsible, and it was also the first thing that had felt right since she left Boston. If I do this, she said slowly, if I tell Whitmore I cannot marry him, There will be scandal. He will be angry. My father will be furious. I will have nowhere to go. You will have me, Austin said simply. I have a cabin on my property, small but solid. You can stay there in privacy and safety for as long as you need. No expectations, no pressure. Just time to figure out what you really want. It was insane. She barely knew this man, but standing here with his hand on her face, with his eyes looking into hers like she was the only person in the world that mattered, Margaret felt more certain than she had felt about anything in months. Saturday morning, she said, her voice shaking. Come to the hotel at dawn before Whitmore arrives. I will be ready. The smile that broke across Austin's face was like the sun rising. He pulled her into his arms, wrapping her in an embrace that felt like coming home, and Margaret pressed her face against his chest and felt his heart beating against her cheek. You will not regret this, he murmured into her hair. I swear to you, Margaret, you will not regret choosing yourself. She pulled back just enough to look up at him. I am terrified. So am I. But I would rather be terrified and honest than comfortable and living a lie. They stood there for another long moment, holding each other in the moonlight, and then Austin walked her back to the hotel, keeping a respectful distance, but staying close enough that she could feel his presence like a shield against the world. At the door, she turned to him one last time. What if this is a mistake? Then it is your mistake to make, he replied, and I will be honored to make it with you. She went inside and up to her room, her mind spinning, her heart racing. She had just agreed to abandon her wedding, to run away with a man she had known for 3 days, to throw away everything her father had planned for her. It was reckless and foolish and possibly the worst decision she had ever made. And yet, as she prepared for bed that night, she felt lighter than she had felt in months. She felt like herself again, like Margaret Rose would instead of a chess piece being moved around a board. She did not sleep much. Instead, she spent the night planning, thinking through what she would need to take with her, what she would say to Whitmore, how she would face the consequences of her choice. As the sky began to lighten toward dawn, she dressed in her most practical traveling clothes and packed a small bag with her essential belongings. Then she sat by the window and waited, her heart hammering in her chest. Austin appeared just as the first rays of sun were touching the rooftops of Cherry Creek. He had a horse for her, a gentle-looking mare, and supplies tied to his own horse's saddle. When she came downstairs, Mrs. Henderson was already up, preparing breakfast in the kitchen, and she looked at Margaret's bag with knowing eyes. So you are making a choice, she said softly. I am, Margaret replied. Is that terribly scandalous? Mrs. Henderson smiled. Terribly, but sometimes the best choices are. Go on, dear. I will deal with Whitmore when he arrives. What will you tell him? The truth, that you changed your mind and that you have every right to do so. Margaret hugged the older woman impulsively. Thank you for everything. Be happy, Margaret. That is all the thanks I need. Austin helped her mount the mare, then swung up onto his own horse with easy grace. As they rode out of town in the early morning light, Margaret looked back only once at Cherry Creek, at the hotel where she had spent 4 days wrestling with her conscience, at the church where she was supposed to have been married in just 8 hours. Then she turned her face forward, toward the open desert and the man riding beside her, and she did not look back again. They rode for an hour through country that was startlingly beautiful in the morning light, the red rocks and sage taking on colors she had not noticed before. Austin pointed out landmarks as they went, telling her stories about the area, asking her questions about Boston and her life there. They talked easily, naturally, as if they had known each other for years instead of days. His property, when they reached it, was a small valley nestled between 2 low hills, with a creek running through it that gave the land a splash of green in the midst of all the brown and red. The cabin was indeed small, just 2 rooms, but it was solidly built with a stone fireplace and real glass windows. It is not much, Austin said as he helped her down from the horse, but it is honest work. built with my own hands. Margaret looked around at the clean simplicity of the space, at the handmade furniture and the tidy kitchen area, and felt something warm spread through her chest. It is perfect. Over the next days, they fell into a routine that felt both strange and natural. Austin showed her his land, teaching her the names of the plants and animals, explaining his plans for expanding the house and increasing his herd. Margaret helped with cooking and cleaning, discovering that she actually enjoyed the physical work in a way she had never enjoyed the ornamental activities expected of her in Boston. But more than the work, they talked. They talked about everything: their childhoods, their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. Austin told her about growing up on a struggling farm in Texas, about losing his parents to fever when he was 16, about working his way west and learning the cattle business from the ground up. Margaret told him about her mother's death, about her father's increasing coldness, about feeling like she was invisible in her own family. And slowly, carefully, they began to touch, a hand on her back as he helped her over rough ground, his fingers brushing hers as they passed a water bucket between them, her hand on his arm as she laughed at something he said. Each touch was deliberate and precious, building a language between them that did not need words. A week after she had left Cherry Creek, Austin returned from a trip to town with news that Whitmore was furious and had put out word that Margaret was a fraud and a deceiver who had used him for her own purposes. Margaret felt a twist of guilt at that, because whatever else Whitmore was, he had not deserved to be abandoned on his wedding day. "I should write to him," she said. "Apologize, at least." Austin looked at her seriously. "You can if you want to, but you do not owe him anything, Margaret. He wanted to own you, not love you. There is a difference. Still, I hurt him. You saved yourself. Those two things are not the same." But Margaret wrote the letter anyway, a brief note acknowledging that she had acted badly, but that she could not go through with a marriage she did not want. She did not know if Whitmore would read it or tear it up, but at least she had tried. She also wrote to her father, a longer and more difficult letter explaining her decision and accepting the consequences. She told him that she understood he would be angry and disappointed, that she knew she had damaged the family's reputation and his business relationship with Whitmore. But she also told him that she could not live her life for his benefit, that she needed to find her own path, even if it meant losing his approval. Austin mailed both letters for her, and then they waited to see what would come of them. Days passed with no response, and Margaret began to relax, to believe that perhaps she really could build a new life here in Nevada, free from the expectations and obligations that had weighed her down for so long. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the desert, Austin reached over and took her hand. It was not the first time they had held hands, but something about this moment felt different, weighted with significance. "Margaret," he said, his voice low and serious, "I need you to know something. I am falling in love with you. Maybe I already have fallen. I do not know exactly when it happened, but I wake up every morning excited to see you, and I go to bed every night grateful that you are here. And if you do not feel the same way, if this is just a place to hide until you figure out what you really want, I need you to tell me now before I fall any deeper." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She turned to look at him, at the vulnerability in his eyes, the hope and fear mixed together in his expression. And she realized that she already knew the answer, had known it since the night she ran away from her wedding, maybe even since the first moment she saw him. "I love you too," she said, and saying it out loud felt like opening a door to a room full of light. "I do not know how it happened so fast, but I love you, Austin. You make me feel real in a way I have never felt before. You make me feel chosen." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, a kiss that was gentle and fierce and full of promise. Margaret melted into him, wrapping her arms around his neck, feeling his heart beating against hers. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard, and Austin rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. not because your father arranged it or because it makes business sense, but because you want to, because you choose me the way I choose you. Yes, Margaret said without hesitation. Yes, I will marry you. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the Patterson Ranch, with Mrs. Henderson and the ranch owner and his wife as witnesses. Margaret wore a simple blue dress that she had made herself, and Austin wore his best shirt and trousers. There was no fancy church, no elaborate dinner, no crowd of important witnesses. But when they said their vows, looking into each other's eyes and meaning every word, Margaret felt more married than she ever would have felt standing in Theodore Whitmore's parlor wearing expensive silk. The life they built together was not easy. Ranching was hard work, with long hours and constant challenges from weather and animals and the unpredictable market. Money was often tight, especially in those first years as Austin expanded his operation. Margaret learned to cook over a wood stove, to mend fences, to help with the calving season. Her hands, once soft and useless, became strong and capable. But it was a good life, an honest life. Austin was everything he had promised: respectful, honest, a partner rather than a master. They made decisions together, worked together, built their future together. And at night, in the privacy of their small cabin that gradually grew larger as Austin added rooms, they explored the physical side of their love with a passion and tenderness that left Margaret amazed that she had ever considered marrying someone else. Her father never replied to her letter, and she took his silence as the disownment she had expected. It hurt, but not as much as she had feared it would. Her brothers wrote occasionally, brief notes that suggested they were more bemused than angry about her choices, and Mrs. Henderson became a dear friend, riding out to visit once a month with news from town and goods that Margaret could not easily get at the ranch. Through Mrs. Henderson, Margaret learned that Theodore Whitmore had eventually married someone else, a widow from Carson City who brought her own mining interests to the Union. She was glad he had found what he was looking for, even if it still felt strange to think that she had almost been his wife. 2 years after their wedding, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She was terrified at first, remembering her mother's difficult pregnancies, but Austin was steady and supportive, bringing her water when she was sick in the mornings, rubbing her aching back at night, talking to her belly, and telling their unborn child stories about the ranch. Their son was born in the spring of 1886, a healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Daniel after Austin's father, and from the moment Margaret held him in her arms, she understood a kind of love she had not known existed. Daniel was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Claire, for Austin's mare who had passed away the year before. And 2 years after that came another son, Robert, who was born during a thunderstorm so violent that Margaret was certain the cabin would blow away. But it stood firm, just like everything else Austin built. The children grew up wild and free, learning to ride before they could properly walk, helping with chores as soon as they were old enough to hold a bucket. Margaret taught them to read and write using books she ordered from San Francisco, and Austin taught them about the land and the animals and the value of hard work. It was not the life she had been raised to expect. She did not have servants or fancy dresses or invitations to important social events. Her days were filled with cooking and cleaning and caring for children and animals instead of embroidery and tea parties and orchestrating elaborate dinner parties. But she was happy, deeply, profoundly happy in a way she had not believed was possible during those dark days in the Cherry Creek Hotel when she had prepared to marry a man she did not love. Sometimes, usually in the evenings after the children were asleep, she and Austin would sit on the porch they had built together, watching the sun set over land that was truly theirs, and she would marvel at how a single choice had changed everything. How walking into a stable and laughing at a man talking to his horse had led to this, a life full of love and struggle and joy and meaning. "Do you ever regret it?" Austin asked her once, maybe 10 years into their marriage. "Giving up the life you could have had with Whitmore? The ease and comfort and security?" Margaret looked at him, at the lines the sun had carved into his face, at the strength in his work-worn hands, at the love in his blue eyes that had never dimmed in all their years together. Never, she said, not for a single moment, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Their ranch prospered over the years. Austin's careful management and hard work paid off, and they were able to buy more land, increase their herds, hire a few ranch hands to help with the heaviest labor. They were never rich, not in the way Whitmore was rich, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were secure in a way that had nothing to do with money. When Daniel was 15, he asked his mother why she had come to Nevada in the first place. They were sitting in the kitchen shelling peas, and Margaret looked at her tall son, who was already starting to resemble his father, and decided he was old enough for the truth. She told him about the arranged marriage, about feeling trapped and desperate, about meeting Austin, and making the choice to follow her heart instead of her father's plans. Daniel listened with wide eyes, and when she finished, he said, "So, if you had married that other man, I would not exist." "No," Margaret agreed, "you would not. Nor would your brother or sister." Daniel thought about that for a moment, then grinned. "I am glad you were brave enough to run away then." "So am I," Margaret said, ruffling his hair. "So am I." The years rolled on, marked by the changing of seasons and the growth of children and the steady rhythm of ranch life. Margaret watched her children grow into strong, capable adults. Daniel took over more and more of the ranch work as Austin's back began to ache from decades of hard labor. Claire proved to have a gift with horses and started breeding and training them, bringing in extra income that allowed them to build a proper barn and expand the house yet again. Robert, the youngest, surprised them all by developing a passion for books and learning, and at 18, he left to attend university in San Francisco, though he promised to come back and apply his learning to making the ranch even better. Margaret's hair began to show threads of silver, and Austin's dark hair turned increasingly gray, but the love between them remained as strong as ever. They still held hands when they walked, still kissed each other good morning and good night, still looked at each other across crowded rooms, and smiled with the secret knowledge of two people who had chosen each other freely and never regretted that choice. One warm evening in the summer of 1905, when Margaret was 44 and Austin was 46, they sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Their grandchildren, Daniel's twin boys, were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening air. Claire was in the barn with her horses, and Robert was visiting from the city with his new wife, a smart woman who taught school and was not afraid of hard work. "We have done well," Austin said, reaching over to take Margaret's hand. "Better than I ever dreamed when I was a broke cowboy working someone else's land." "We have," Margaret agreed, lacing her fingers through his. "But you know what the best part is?" "What?" "I chose this. I chose you. And every single day since then, I have woken up grateful for that choice. You gave me something precious, Austin. You gave me the chance to choose my own life." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "And you chose me, a rough cowboy with nothing but a dream and a small piece of land. You could have had silk dresses and servants and a mansion in town." "I have something better," Margaret said, looking around at the ranch they had built together, at the family they had created, at the life they had chosen. "I have love, real, honest, true love. That is worth more than all the silk dresses and mansions in the world." As the sun set over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret Kincaid sat with her husband's hand in hers and felt completely, perfectly content. She had been promised to a man she had never met, but a cowboy had given her a chance to choose instead. And she had chosen love. She had chosen freedom. She had chosen herself. And in doing so, she had found everything she never knew she needed. A partner who respected her, children who brought her joy, a life full of purpose and meaning, and decades of happiness that no amount of money or social standing could ever have bought. the story of how she came to Nevada as one man's intended bride and became another man's chosen wife, became family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren over the years. And every time she told it, Margaret emphasized the same lesson, that a life built on your own choices, even difficult and scary ones, was infinitely better than a life lived according to someone else's plans. Years later, when her grandsons were old enough to understand, one of them asked her if she had been scared when she ran away from her wedding to marry their grandfather instead. Terrified, Margaret admitted, but I was even more scared of living my whole life wondering what might have been. Sometimes the scariest choice is also the right one. The ranch continued to thrive under Daniel's management, with Claire's horse breeding operation becoming well known throughout Nevada, and Robert bringing modern business practices that helped them weather economic downturns that destroyed less well managed operations. The Kincaid name became respected in Cherry Creek and the surrounding area, not because of wealth or social standing, but because of integrity and hard work. Margaret and Austin lived long enough to see their children's children grow and start families of their own. They celebrated 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren, in a house that had grown from a small 2-room cabin into a sprawling ranch house full of love and laughter. Austin passed away in his sleep on a cold winter night in 1913 at the age of 74. Margaret woke to find him still and peaceful beside her, and though her heart broke, she was grateful that he had not suffered, that he had simply slipped away after a life well lived. She lived another 7 years without him, surrounded by family, still sharp and active despite her advancing age. She spent her time teaching her grandchildren to read, helping Claire with the horses, and writing down the stories of her life so that future generations would know where they came from. Margaret Rose Kincaid passed away peacefully in the spring of 1920 at the age of 59 in the house that she and Austin had built together. Her children and grandchildren gathered around her bed, and her last words were, "Tell them I chose love. Tell them it was worth it." She was buried next to Austin on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a headstone that read, "Margaret Rose Kincaid, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She chose her own path and never looked back." And on Austin's stone, placed there by Margaret herself after his death, were the words, "Austin James Kincaid, beloved husband, father, and grandfather. He gave her a choice when no one else would." The ranch remained in the Kincaid family for generations, each new generation learning the story of how it all began, with a woman who had the courage to choose love over security, and a cowboy who offered her that choice when society said she had none. In Cherry Creek, the story became legend. The tale of Margaret Rosewood, the Boston heiress who left Theodore Whitmore at the altar and ran away with a cowboy, was told in saloons and at dinner tables, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with disapproval, but always with interest. Theodore Whitmore himself, in his later years, was once asked about the incident at a business dinner in Carson City. By then he had been married to his second wife for over 30 years and had children and grandchildren of his own. He thought for a long moment before answering. "Margaret Rosewood was the best thing that never happened to me," he said finally. "If she had married me, I would have had a beautiful wife and an advantageous connection to her father's business. But she would have been miserable, and eventually that misery would have poisoned both our lives. She did us both a favor by having the courage to say no. I hope she found what she was looking for." When told of this comment years later by a traveling merchant, Margaret smiled and said, "I did. I found everything I was looking for and more." The life Margaret and Austin built together was not perfect. There were hard times, crop failures, harsh winters, illnesses that scared them, arguments that made them both angry. But through it all, they had something that sustained them, the knowledge that they had chosen each other freely, that their love was built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation or convenience, and that choice, made in the moonlight outside a stable in Cherry Creek, Nevada, in the summer of 1883, rippled out through generations. The children of Margaret and Austin having grown up watching their parents' loving partnership, chose their own spouses with care and built their own happy marriages. Their grandchildren did the same. The Kincaid family became known not just for their successful ranch, but for the strength of their marriages and the love that bound them together. Daniel often said that his parents had given him the greatest gift, an example of what real love looked like. Claire told her daughters that true strength was having the courage to choose your own path, even when everyone told you that you were wrong. Robert wrote his mother's story down in a book that was published after her death, a testament to one woman's courage in an era when women had few choices and little power. The original cabin where Margaret and Austin had begun their married life was preserved and eventually incorporated into the much larger house as a kind of shrine to their beginning. Margaret's children made sure that room was always kept exactly as it had been, with the simple furniture Austin had made with his own hands, the small stove where Margaret had learned to cook, the bed where they had shared so much love and intimacy. On the mantel in that preserved room sat a small wooden box containing the letters Margaret had written but never sent during those 4 dark days in the Cherry Creek Hotel when she had been preparing to marry Theodore Whitmore. She had saved them as a reminder of how close she had come to a life of misery, how a few moments of courage had changed everything. One letter, written the night before Austin had found her wandering near the stable, was particularly poignant. In it, Margaret had written to her deceased mother, pouring out all her fears and doubts and desperate unhappiness. The letter ended with the words, "I wish you were here to tell me what to do, Mama. I wish you could tell me if I am being foolish to want more than security and comfort. Is it wrong to want to be loved? Is it wrong to want to choose?" Reading that letter decades later always made Margaret grateful for the choice she had made. Her mother could not tell her what to do, but Austin had given her the freedom to choose for herself, and she had chosen love, chosen freedom, chosen a life of her own making. The legacy of that choice extended far beyond the Kincaid family. In Cherry Creek, Margaret's story inspired other women to question their own circumstances, to demand more from their lives and their marriages. Not everyone had the courage to follow her example, but her story planted seeds that grew slowly over the decades. Mrs. Henderson, who had encouraged Margaret to make her own choice, often told the story to young women who stayed at her hotel, using it as an example that it was never too late to change course, that courage and conviction could open doors that seemed permanently closed. Even Theodore Whitmore, though he never admitted it publicly, was changed by the experience. His second marriage was different from what his first would have been. He consulted his wife on business matters, treated her as a partner rather than an ornament, and made sure his daughters had more choices in their own lives than most girls of their generation. As the 20th century progressed and women's rights began to expand, Margaret's story took on new resonance. Her granddaughters and great-granddaughters grew up in a world where women could vote, own property in their own names, and have legal rights in their marriages. They understood that they owed some of that freedom to women like their grandmother, who had fought for their own choices even when society offered them none. The last person to remember Margaret and Austin personally was their youngest grandchild, a girl named Margaret after her grandmother, who lived until 1985. She was fond of telling reporters and historians who wanted to know about the Old West that her grandparents' story was not really about the West at all. It was about two people who had the courage to choose love in a world that valued property and social standing above genuine feeling. My grandmother used to say that she had been given a gift, the younger Margaret told an oral history interviewer in 1982. Not wealth or beauty or social position, but the gift of choice. And she spent the rest of her life honoring that gift by making sure everyone around her knew they had choices too. She taught her children, especially her daughters, that their lives belonged to them, not to their fathers or husbands or society. That was revolutionary in 1883, and in some ways it is still revolutionary now. The ranch that Austin and Margaret built together still stands, now operated by the sixth generation of Kincaids. The land has been expanded and modernized with equipment and methods that would astound Austin and Margaret, but the core values remain the same: hard work, honest dealing, and the importance of family. In the main house, in a place of honor, hangs a photograph taken on Margaret and Austin's 50th wedding anniversary. In it, they sit side by side on their porch, his hand covering hers, both of them smiling at the camera with the ease of two people who have spent a lifetime together and regret none of it. Margaret is 72 in the photo, Austin 74, their faces lined with age, but their eyes still bright with love. Visitors to the ranch often stop to look at that photograph, drawn by something in their expressions, some quality of contentment and joy that transcends the old-fashioned clothes and the sepia tone of the image. The current generation of Kincaids always tells those visitors the story of how it began, with a woman who had been promised to a man she had never met and a cowboy who gave her a chance to choose instead. And that choice, made over a century ago on a moonlit night in Nevada, continues to echo through time, a reminder that the greatest adventures often begin with the courage to choose your own path, even when that path leads away from everything safe and familiar and into the unknown. Margaret chose love. She chose freedom. She chose life on her own terms. And in the end, she found that those choices gave her something money could never buy: a life full of meaning, a love that lasted a lifetime, and a legacy that would inspire generations yet to come. The story of Margaret and Austin Kincaid is not just a story of the Old West. It is a story of human courage and the transformative power of love, freely given and freely received. It is a story about the importance of honoring our own truth, even when doing so requires us to walk away from everything we have known. Most of all, it is a story about choice and how a single brave decision can change not just one life, but the lives of generations to come, rippling out through time like waves on water, touching people who will never even know the names of those who made that first brave choice. Margaret Rose Kincaid lived a good life, a full life, a life rich with love and purpose and joy. And it all began on a dusty August day in 1883 when she stepped off a stagecoach in Cherry Creek, Nevada, promised to a man she had never met, and found instead a cowboy who would give her the most precious gift of all: the freedom to choose her own destiny.